This is the PowerApps Podcast, the podcast all about Microsoft Power Apps and Flow. This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integration affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise customers from over 70 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. KingswaySoft works with the Common Data Service, so it's a great tool for extending your Power App. We thank KingswaySoft for sponsoring the PowerApps Podcast from CRM Audio.
Hello and welcome to the pilot podcast episode of the PowerApps Podcast here on the CRM Audio Network. I am Shawn Tabor, and I'll be facilitating the conversation. This is a bit of a departure for the CRM Audio Network. With the PowerApps Podcast, we're going to have multiple hosts over the course of the next few episodes, and it's going to bring a little bit of difference in insight to Power Apps and Flow. We'll be covering both those, as well as any other related technologies to Power Apps and Flow. So it should be pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And for today's episode, we're starting out with my colleague Tyler Kneisly, who has done a bit of work with Flow in Power Apps, and he's going to bring a nice little spin to the CRM Audio Network. So, Tyler, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You are quite welcome. Hopefully, you're going to make this easy for me, and I just have to ask a few questions here and there, and that's the plan anyway. So, but yeah, so really with the Power Apps Podcast, we're going to, like I said, we're going to go into Power Apps and Flow, not necessarily covering both all the time, but as the weeks go on, we'll cover updates to the infrastructure, news from the product team, things of that nature. But today, from what I understood, Tyler, we're going to focus a little more on Flow today than with Power Apps. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And what about Flow did you want to talk about today?
Well, I wanted to talk about Flow as something I refer to as a last mile tool in a CRM implementation.
Okay. And what do you mean by last mile? I think I understand the connotation, but for the audience, let's expand that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a concept that I first read about in CRM magazine. There was an article by Alan Bond which talked about the last mile strategy in terms of agile implementation, and really he was focusing on mobile apps in his article. But the idea struck me as timely and relevant for a project I happened to be working on at the time, because we were concerned about user adoption, and we were looking for a strategy that would help us to sort of close the gap on user expectation and functionality inside of the system. And so we were looking for those parts of dynamics where maybe the last mile wasn't really considered as part of the overall strategy, and where we could help the end users themselves close the gap in an agile way. And Flow is a natural tool for that. Last mile as a concept, if you think about travel as an example, you can easily book a flight from Los Angeles to New York City, and you'll pick your airline, you'll pick your time, you'll figure out where you're going to drop your car off if you drive. You'll fly, and then you'll get there, and then undoubtedly you'll have things in New York you'll want to do. And that's really the last mile. Are you going to get an Uber? Are you going to get a taxi? What hotel are you staying at? And can you do these things for yourself? So this is very relevant in Dynamics implementations as well.
Okay, great. So do you have some examples of how Flow could be used in that last mile? I mean, there's a lot of different connectors we have available to us. There's a lot of different functions within Flow that we could use. But what are some ideas that really could help user adoption or user acceptance in that last mile using Flow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it helps to get an understanding of what Flow is for anybody who maybe isn't familiar. It's an automation tool. So if you've got Office 365 and you look at some of the things that are included with that, you've got, depending on the flavor that you have, you may have SharePoint and you'll have OneDrive and all the Office apps. And then if you've looked at that, you may see an icon there for Flow and wondered what it is. It's similar in a lot of ways to other automation tools that have been popularized lately, like IFTTT, Zapier, where it's sort of this recipe-based, connector-based, drag and drop, more or less, tooling that lets you connect third-party services or remote pieces of data and tie an action, a trigger and an action to them. So sort of to answer your question, if I was looking for something in Dynamics that might help me to automatically handle an email that gets pulled into my CRM system and digest it and then do something with it. I've got classic tools such as workflows right inside of CRM, but maybe I don't want to go through the trouble of contacting my developer or consultant and seeing what we can do to build a plugin that might interface with Azure and then access a web API for a third-party platform, just so I can drop a task into Todoist, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Flow lets that happen very simply, very easily. A user can wire up an action, a trigger in exchange. An email comes in and it matches certain criteria. It's a high priority, or it comes from a certain person, and they can wire that up to an action such as creating a to-do task in Todoist, or creating a follow-up record in Dynamics CRM, or multiple steps. One of the things that really makes Flow powerful, I think, is its ability to check conditions and take different paths or handle different routing based on the conditions in the flow.
So now, when you're talking about with that trigger from an email, because with Flow, it's important to know you really do have to have a trigger for that flow to execute, right? It's not something that's just automatically going to happen without some kind of nudge, if you will.
Correct. Yeah, there's always got to be a trigger. And what's interesting about your triggers and your actions as well in Flow is based on the different 200 plus connectors that Microsoft has. They've cultivated a certain set of triggers and a certain set of actions for each of their connectors. Not all of them will have triggers, and not all of them will have actions. So, if you, for instance, wanted to connect your Flow to a PowerApp, you can certainly trigger a flow via a PowerApp, via button click in your PowerApp. You can also send information back to your PowerApp as an action, but the two are exclusive. You need to have triggered via the PowerApp in order to use the action of sending data back into your PowerApp.
Right, and I've experienced that. And if you really want a good exposure to that interaction, triggering an action from a Power App, I would check out the app in a day resource kit. It's the slide deck that they used and to walk you through how to create a Canvas-based form or a Canvas-based Power App, wire it up to a Flow, as well as wired it up to external data sources, and we'll include a link in the show notes for how to get to that information. But that's a great resource if you've never stepped through this before.
Oh, so regarding the question about who would be using this and how this applies in a last mile type scenario, you may be in a mixed environment. You may have different platforms where maybe different types of information is stored. For example, there are products out there like Trello and Slack that are very popular right now. Slack is a communications platform that's comparable to Microsoft Teams. Trello is a simple Kanban type board for tracking tasks. And you may have more users that are using those products than maybe in Dynamics. It's certainly something we see in a lot of implementations where not all of the organization that we're doing an implementation at will be licensed users in Dynamics. But because they've got these other platforms, they may want to use them. So you may have leads coming in Dynamics. You may want to use it for leads and sales tracking, or you may want to use it for its field service functionality or project service automation. But you'll still want to maybe route tasks or things that you need interaction from other users onto, maybe say Trello. You can take an event where a record is created in Dynamics, and you can easily post cards or tasks to Trello, or you can create new projects in Trello, etc. Same thing for other products. They've got VoIP services, connectors, et cetera, and social network connectors as well. It's definitely a consumer platform. So if there's an instance where you need a more robust integration, you should certainly talk to your consultant or your internal development team. But where you just want to quickly wire up two services to each other, it's a very capable platform.
So really, in terms of the last mile, is it really? I could see some of these scenarios where you could use a Dynamics plugin, or you could use a workflow to do some of this kind of automation. But is this more? Is the last mile concept more along the lines of it's doing it in a manner that is more relevant to the specific end user and what applications they use, and Flow enables you to create these with proper security permissions, obviously. It allows the user more access to create these things, as opposed to having to have someone from your development team create potentially a plugin, or someone, if you may not have security permissions, to create a workflow as a business user. But Flow is something you have a little more flexibility to.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I would also add that's probably a little bit more nuanced than that. It probably depends a lot on your organization or the organization you're working with if you're a consultant. You mentioned security, and obviously security is a major concern. This may not be a tool that your organization would want to use if you are in an organization that is concerned with, say, HIPAA compliancy or something, or at least make sure that the types of connectors that you use are properly governed. For example, you may not want your end users connecting to Dropbox to drop files that are being associated with a customer record into this third-party files storage tool. So security is a big concern, or it's something that needs to be considered in implementation. But the other part of your explanation, I think, is extremely valid. Microsoft has been more or less democratizing a lot of their technologies over the years, and you see this pattern all the time. For example, with Microsoft Office, at one point, the only way that you could make Microsoft Office applications do something more than what they did out of the box was if you knew a little bit of VB, Visual Basic, and you could crack open the developer tools inside of Office, and you could build a macro, or you could develop an add-in. And that required a fair amount of expertise. Microsoft fairly recently, I think it was just 2 or 3 years ago, they launched a new way of building add-ins that allowed you to build them with web languages. You could build it with JavaScript and HTML, host it in your SharePoint site or somewhere else, and easily interact with your Office applications. And then they've gone even further and introduced tools online that allow you almost drag and drop functionality in terms of quickly putting together an add-in for Office. And this is sort of another extension of that. Obviously, it probably wasn't where they were thinking when they built Flow, that they were wanting to extend Office and make it easier to replace macros. But in a sense, that is what it's doing. You've got the macro functionality that's been tried and true and used for years in Microsoft Office. And now you've got this new functionality that even the most non-technical user can wrap their head around and figure ways to automate and add functionality to their existing technology.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because with the macro concept, in financial services, I worked for years in financial services, and we had advisors who lived and died by those macros in their VB add-ins, add-ins to their Excel spreadsheets for getting market data, right, in a certain manner and template that they wanted it, right? So this kind of is a similar analogy to where the core system itself is configured for the enterprise, say, but what Flow is giving is a way that individual business users, citizen developers, if you will, have a little bit more flexibility to personalize their experience and have flexibility in the way that they interact with the system. A good example, I mean, if you go onto the Flow site and just look at some of the templates, right? The templates by themselves, they're not all Dynamics related, but you can connect them to Dynamics if you wanted to. For example, there's a template that says send myself a reminder in 10 minutes. So that's a Flow button for mobile. You could press that button and you'll get a reminder. You could connect that to Dynamics and link it to an activity that you want to be reminded on, or an action that you want to. You could get updates from, there's a template for get updates from the Flow blog. But conversely, if you have an RSS feed, you can connect that to any data source. So if you wanted to get updates from a certain blog that you follow, let's just say it's the atyourservicepod.com blog for one of our sister podcasts, or if you wanted to get updates from the CRM audio page, you could do that through Flow. So I mean, they're just different capabilities to customize your experience using Dynamics with the addition of Flow. So that it's a neat concept. I like the comparison between Excel macros. That definitely hit home for me.
That's great. Yeah, that's actually, as a matter of coincidence, that was one of the experiences that I had in a previous organization that was eye-opening for me when it came to Flow. We had spent a significant amount of time, the team that I was on, myself, one of our lead developers at the time, building out this intricate approval process in Dynamics that was just really robust. We were really proud of it. And it was based on this concept that if you have a business process flow in a record, you could go to this other record and this approval process record, and you could say, I want to turn this business process flow into an approval process, and it would look at each stage of that BPF, that business process flow, and it would insert basically an approval sign-off type field in the business process flow. And anytime the business process flow from then on forward would enter into a certain stage in a record, it would fire off to the appropriate parties and let them send in their approval, first one in, first one out. Right? If it's being sent to all the VPs and the first VP approves it, and that worked, and the approval was recorded, et cetera, et cetera. And then Flow came out, and we started looking at it, and could we potentially incorporate it into our approval process? And we were just floored, because we found that there was really no reason to even have our approval process the way we built it anymore. We could replace the whole thing with Flow and turn the power back over to the users, the citizen developers, as you called it, and let them tailor it on the fly. They didn't need any more for the list of who could approve to be semi-hard-coded in an entity or in a plugin somewhere. They could simply update their flow, which is another good point. Sort of segueing into, well, transitioning back to, I guess, a question you had asked earlier. The individuals are certainly the target audience for Flow, but Flow also supports team flows as well. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a business organization and you happen to have a team within that organization where the manager or the supervisor or just a member of the team has come up with a way of improving efficiency, and it's powered by a Microsoft Flow, the team can adopt that and distribute it across the team. So some excellent tools for sharing and distributing flows as well.
And there's another interesting Flow use case I came across recently. My daughter is a third grade teacher, and she, unbeknownst to me, was using forms for quizzes, which blew my mind, because I didn't even think of that. But she was creating small quizzes based on reading exercises, right? And she wanted a way to get the results sent to her automatically, and she couldn't figure out how. So what we did is we wired up a flow to her form, and it pushed the results of the questions with the answers right into an Excel spreadsheet. And you could do something similar in a business context with sending if you wanted, for example, you had a business trip to New York City and you wanted to get a list of all of your clients in a certain zip code. You could query Dynamics and have that list of contacts or accounts sent right to a spreadsheet and emailed to you, or put in your OneDrive. So there's a lot of different. I think you're only limited by your creativity and obviously the connectors that are available. But if you can also extend the capabilities via Azure Functions or PowerApps. And I think I think what you've said today about the last mile is definitely key, because it's that fit and finish, that polish at the end, that really helps the end user feel comfortable with their implementation and how they're interacting with the data, whether it's in Dynamics, Office, Todoist, whatever the app is. It's how they work with their data the way they want to work, which is really great.
Yeah, and really key. One thing that we've learned a lot in virtually any market, any industry right now, any vertical, is that customer service has changed drastically over the past 10 years. And they talk a lot about your multi-channel service and being able to let your customers seek out service in whichever channel that they want. And this is sort of the same concept, but internally, people haven't changed. They don't behave any differently just because they're no longer seeking out service, but rather seeking the best way to do a business process. Their behaviors are still the same. So if internally you have a way that allows them to quickly do something the way that they want, or put them in touch with their information in a way that makes sense to them, or even just allows them to use the tool to quickly prototype a concept because they can't explain the technical equation to somebody, then you've relieved them of a lot of that burden of just not getting the platform or not understanding why it's not doing the thing that they want it to do. As consultants, it's also a powerful tool for people who are interacting with organizations that are implementing, since it provides them with just that excellent tool that allows them to build automation in a way that's not even that makes sense to non-technical people. It can show people how these web APIs talk to each other, how these services can talk to each other without it really exposing the API itself. And that's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. I think this has been a great pilot podcast episode for the PowerApps Podcast. And if I said another P word, I'll probably explode. But for the folks listening out there, Tyler, if they wanted to get in touch with you out on the interwebs, how would they do that?
That is a great question. I've got, obviously you can look me up on LinkedIn and all the normal social media channels, but I have a website. It's doucrm.com. It's all spelled out, doucrm.com. Not a lot of content there. It's something I've kicked the tires on a few times, but I'm going to be posting an article, hopefully before this podcast goes live, that outlines that concept of the last mile, and that should be up on there for anybody who's interested.
All right, we'll put a link to that site on the show notes. And are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, also the same handle. It's doucrm.
All right, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Tyler, this has been fun, and I think you'll be back not in the next episode, but the one after that. I think episode 3 will come back to you. It's kind of going to be kind of like a fun rotation, mix it up a little bit, and and I think on episode 2, we're going to be talking with Chris Huntingford, Kyle Hill, and we're going to dive deep into some stuff they've talked about at their recent hackathon, going over PowerApps and Flow as well. So I guess that's it. That's the first episodes in the books for the PowerApps Podcast on the CRM Audio Network. Well done,
Very
Tyler.
Cool. Well done, Shawn.
All right, very cool. Thanks, everybody, and we will talk to you guys next time on the PowerApps Podcast.
This has been the PowerApps Podcast from CRM Audio. Send us your feedback at mail@powerappspodcast.com. Check out other episodes from the CRM Audio Network by going to CRM Audio in your browser or searching for CRM Audio on Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, any place else that you can find podcasts. This is a production of Dynamics Podcast, LLC.